They'll trade me to the enemy unless you claim me as your wife. That's what she said to him. The Apache woman, her wrist raw from the rope that bit into her skin, pressed herself against the splintered wooden post. Her name was Sarah Morningstar, and for 3 days she'd been the prize captive of Fort Dalton, a living trophy. But she knew with the certainty of a coming storm that her time was running out. The whispers among the soldiers were getting louder. Tomorrow, tomorrow they would decide her fate. And their version of fate was a death sentence wrapped in a transfer order. Captain James Mitchell felt her eyes on him long before he approached the prison yard. He always did. This woman didn't look at him like the other captives. There was no fear, no pleading, just a quiet, unnerving assessment. He was a weathered man, carved from the same unforgiving Arizona landscape that surrounded them. His uniform was stained with the dust of a dozen campaigns, his face a roadmap of battles won and friends lost. He was not a man who commanded from behind a desk. He commanded from the front line, and his men respected him for it. He stopped a few feet away, just beyond her reach. His hand rested on the grip of his Colt, a habit so ingrained it was like breathing. Not a threat, just a state of being, always ready. Around them, the fort hummed with the dreary rhythm of survival. The blacksmith's hammer rang, horses whinnied in the stables. The smell of beans and salted pork hung in the blistering air. It was all so normal, so routine. But today something was different. Today the air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. Sarah had learned to read men. It was a skill her father, the great Chief Red Hawk, had taught her. And this man, Captain Mitchell, was different from the others. He was dangerous, yes, every soldier was. But he wasn't cruel. She'd seen him give his own water ration to a dying private. She'd seen him sit with men as they breathed their last, offering a comfort that transcended the war they were fighting. Then she saw him, Lieutenant Carson. He was stepping out of the administration building, a sheaf of papers in his sweating hand. Carson was everything Mitchell was not. His uniform was crisp, his buttons polished. He was a man who enjoyed the power his rank gave him, a man who found pleasure in the suffering of others. The tribes whispered his name around their fires, a boogeyman in a blue coat. Carson smiled while he worked, they said, and his work was torture. The papers in his hand were her death warrant. She knew it. Mitchell saw him too. The captain's body shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible change. His relaxed stance hardened, his shoulders squared. It was the look of a wolf spotting another predator encroaching on its territory. Sarah strained to hear the gossip from the sentries on the wall. Words drifted on the desert wind. Transfer. Apache scouts. Chiricahua. Her blood ran cold. The Chiricahua scouts weren't just Apache who worked for the army. They were turncoats, men who had betrayed their own people for gold and whiskey. They were led by a man named Diablo, a ghost who moved through the canyons, leaving only bodies in his wake. They would take her. They would spend days, maybe weeks, ripping information from her mind about her father's war plans. And when they were done, when she was nothing but a broken shell, they would sell what was left of her to slavers in Mexico. Or simply leave her for the vultures. Mitchell's gray eyes flickered towards her, and for a single breathtaking moment, their gazes locked. In that instant, she saw it. Not pity, not mercy, but understanding. He saw the corner she was backed into. He saw the checkmate that was only one move away. But what he didn't see, what no one could see, was that Sarah Morningstar had one last move to make. It was a gamble so desperate, so insane, that it just might work. As Carson approached, his pale eyes gleaming with triumph, the words formed in Sarah's throat. Everything depended on this. Everything depended on the heart of a man who was, by all rights, her sworn enemy. She waited for Carson to deliver his news, to gloat over his victory. The lieutenant explained the orders with a smug smile. A transfer, effective at dawn. She was to be handed over to the government's allied scouts as a sign of goodwill, a bargaining chip. Mitchell's jaw was a line of granite. He said nothing, but Sarah could feel the rage radiating from him. He was a man bound by honor, but also by the chain of command. Carson outranked him on this matter, a political appointment from some senator back east. Mitchell's hands were tied. As Carson turned to walk away, victorious, Sarah spoke. Her voice was low, but it cut through the oppressive heat like a shard of ice. Captain Mitchell. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. They trade me to enemy scouts tomorrow, she said, her accented English clear and steady. These traitors, they will torture me. Make me tell them about my father's camps, about the water holes. When they are finished, they will sell me. Mitchell remained silent, his gray eyes boring into hers. He knew she was telling the truth. He had seen what the turncoat scouts did to their prisoners. It was a fate worse than any battlefield death. You have honor not like him, she pressed, nodding towards Carson's retreating back. You see an Apache woman as a person, not just a thing. This was it, the moment of truth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence. What are you asking of me? He finally asked, his voice a low rumble. And that's when she played her final desperate card. The one that would either save her life or get them both killed. Marry me, she said. The words hung in the air between them. A shocking, impossible proposal. Mitchell's eyes widened, the first crack in his stoic facade. He stared at her as if she had just sprouted a second head. He thought she was mad, delirious from the sun. But Sarah pressed on, her voice urgent, racing against the ticking clock of her own execution. White man's law, she said, the words feeling foreign and strange on her tongue. The law says a wife belongs to her husband. Even the army, even Lieutenant Carson, cannot take a soldier's wife without cause. It was a loophole, a tiny, obscure piece of legal text she had overheard years ago at another fort, a desperate prayer whispered into the heart of the enemy camp. Footsteps were approaching again. It was Sergeant Williams, Mitchell's right-hand man, coming with her meager water ration. Their time was running out. Why? Mitchell asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why should I risk my career, my life for you? Information, she said, her eyes never leaving his. I know where my father plans to attack next. I know where the Mescalero have hidden a cache of rifles stolen from a wagon train. I can give you something that will save dozens of your soldiers' lives. His eyes sharpened. This was a language he understood. Strategy, tactics, an advantage in a war that had been a bloody stalemate for years. He was a good man, yes, but he was also a soldier. And a soldier knows the value of intelligence. But then she saw the doubt creep back in. How do I know you're telling the truth? He asked. How do I know this isn't a trick? It was a fair question. She was the enemy, the daughter of the man he was paid to hunt. Tomorrow at dawn, she said, her voice dropping lower, so low that even the wind couldn't steal her words. 2 of my father's scouts will approach from the eastern ridge. They think the fort is lazy in the morning. They come to count your horses and test your defenses. Put your men in the rocks north of the trail. You can take them alive. It was specific. It was verifiable. It was a test, a gesture of good faith that would cost her people 2 skilled warriors. It was a painful sacrifice, but her life was on the line. Sergeant Williams arrived, his presence breaking the spell. He offered the captain a casual salute, his eyes darting curiously between the intense officer and the bound captive. Captain, he said, brought the prisoner her water. Mitchell didn't move. He didn't take his eyes off Sarah. He was calculating, weighing the life of an Apache woman against the lives of his men, weighing his honor against his career, weighing the word of a captive against the orders of a superior officer. The entire fort seemed to be holding its breath. Then he made his decision. Sergeant, Mitchell said, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. I need a moment more with the prisoner. Wait by the stables. Williams, a veteran of 100 such moments, knew an order when he heard one. He touched the brim of his hat. Sir. And he was gone. The moment the sergeant was out of earshot, Mitchell leaned in close. You understand what this means? He said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. If I do this, there is no going back. Your people will call you a traitor. You will be an outcast forever. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Better to be a live traitor than a dead Apache, she said, the harsh logic of it hanging in the air. I will be breathing. That is all that matters. A new sound cut through the air, the thunder of hooves, a patrol, returning from the north, riding hard. They were kicking up a storm of dust, and they rode with an urgency that screamed trouble. Lieutenant Carson hurried out to meet them, his face eager. He was hungry for news, for any report that would reinforce his decision to get rid of Sarah. Any sign of increased war party activity would be all the justification he needed to expedite her transfer, to hand her over to the butchers tonight instead of waiting for morning. The patrol leader dismounted, speaking in low, urgent tones to Carson. The lieutenant's face lit up with a cruel sort of glee. He was nodding, his eyes darting over to where Mitchell and Sarah stood. The clock had just sped up. The fuse was now impossibly short. "Captain," Sarah whispered, her voice laced with desperation, "you must decide. Now." Mitchell looked from the glee on Carson's face to the desperation in hers. He saw the trap closing. He saw the final move being played. And in that moment, he chose his side. He straightened up, his face set like stone, and his voice cut across the compound, sharp and clear as a bugle call. "Sergeant Williams!" The grizzled sergeant appeared almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for the summons. "Sir! Find Chaplain Morrison. Tell him to meet me in my quarters. Immediately." Williams' eyebrows shot up. The chaplain? Now? But he just nodded. "Right away, sir. Anything else?" Mitchell took a deep breath, the kind a man takes before diving into freezing water. He looked directly at Sarah, then back to his most trusted man. "Yes, Sergeant," he said, and the entire fort seemed to lean in to hear his next words. "Cut the prisoner's bonds and escort her to my quarters." The silence that followed was deafening. Williams froze, his hand hovering over the knife at his belt. Releasing an Apache prisoner? Taking her to the captain's private quarters? It was unthinkable. It was a violation of a dozen regulations. "Sir," Williams stammered, "Lieutenant Carson's orders. The transfer." Mitchell's eyes turned to steel. "Lieutenant Carson answers to me, Sergeant. The prisoner is now under my personal protection." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, for reasons that will soon become very clear. The authority in his voice was absolute. Williams, a soldier to his core, did not hesitate again. He strode forward, drew his knife, and with two quick slashes, the ropes binding Sarah's wrists fell away into the dust. Freedom. The blood rushed back into her hands with a painful tingle. She rubbed her chafed skin, her legs unsteady beneath her. For 3 days she had been an object, a piece of property tied to a post. Now she was a person again. And then she saw Carson, storming across the compound toward them, his face purple with rage. "Mitchell, what is the meaning of this?" he roared, his voice cracking. "That prisoner is military property. I will have you court-martialed for this." Mitchell turned to face him, calm and unmoving as a mountain. He stood slightly in front of Sarah, a human shield. "Her status has changed, Lieutenant," Mitchell said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Changed? How has it changed?" Carson spat, his hand creeping toward the pistol at his hip. Mitchell let a small, grim smile touch his lips. It was a smile that promised violence. "You'll find it's against Army regulations to transfer another man's fiancée." Fiancée. The word hit Carson like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He stared from Mitchell to Sarah, his mind refusing to process what he was hearing. You're insane," he finally choked out. "Marrying a savage? A dirty Apache? They'll strip you of your commission. They'll throw you in the stockade." The insult was meant for her, but it was Mitchell who reacted. In a blur of motion, he closed the distance between them, his face inches from Carson's. "You will speak of Miss Morning Star with respect," Mitchell growled, his voice a low threat that promised pain. "Or I will forget we are wearing the same uniform." The threat was unmistakable. A duel. Here and now. Carson, for all his cruelty, was a coward at heart. He paled, taking a half step back. He knew, as everyone at Fort Dalton knew, that Captain James Mitchell had never lost a fight in his life. Just then, Chaplain Morrison arrived, a bewildered look on his face. "Captain, Sergeant Williams said it was an emergency?" Mitchell turned, his anger vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a steely resolve. "It is, Chaplain," he said. "I need you to perform a marriage ceremony, right now." The chaplain looked at Mitchell, then at the Apache woman standing beside him, her wrists still red from the ropes. He looked at the furious Lieutenant Carson and the stunned soldiers gathering around. The old chaplain had seen many strange things on the frontier, but this was something new. He was a man of God, but he was also a man of the army. He knew the trouble this would cause. "Captain," he began, his voice hesitant, "are you certain? This is highly irregular." "I am certain," Mitchell said, "and my bride has consented." With that, he turned to Sarah. He didn't offer his arm. He didn't make some grand, romantic gesture. He simply looked at her, his gray eyes asking a silent question. "Are you ready for this?" She lifted her chin and met his gaze. She was the daughter of a chief. She was a survivor. She nodded once. The walk to the chapel was the longest of her life. Every eye in the fort was on them. She could feel their judgment, their suspicion, their hatred. They saw a soldier betraying his own kind for an enemy savage. They didn't see a man of honor. They didn't see a woman fighting for her life. But then, another thought struck her, a cold spike of fear. Mitchell was risking everything for her. But why? Was it just honor? Or was there something else? Something he wasn't telling her. The information she'd offered him, the scouts on the ridge, the hidden rifles, it was valuable, yes. But was it valuable enough to justify this level of risk? To throw away a decorated military career? To make an enemy of a man as connected and vindictive as Carson? Something didn't add up. They stepped inside the crude wooden chapel. The air was cool and smelled of dust and old timber. Chaplain Morrison opened his worn Bible, his hands trembling slightly. Sergeant Williams stood by the door as a witness, his face a mask of disbelief. The ceremony was a blur, a strange collection of foreign words and ancient rituals that meant nothing to her people. But when Mitchell turned to face her, to speak his vows, she saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't just going through the motions. He wasn't just creating a legal shield. He meant it. "I, James Mitchell, take you, Sarah Morningstar, to be my wedded wife." He spoke the words with a conviction that shook her to her core. He promised to have and to hold, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. He promised to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Then it was her turn. She repeated the vows, her voice gaining strength with each word. It was a promise, an oath. She had offered him information in exchange for her life. But now in this dusty chapel, it felt like something more. A real alliance, a partnership forged in fire. He slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. It had belonged to his mother, he whispered, a sacred trust passed from one generation to the next. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the chaplain declared, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. Outside, Lieutenant Carson was stewing in his own rage. He had been publicly humiliated. His authority had been undermined. His prized prisoner, the key to ingratiating himself with the ruthless Diablo and his turncoat scouts, had been snatched from his grasp. But Carson wasn't a man who accepted defeat. As Captain Mitchell and his new Apache bride walked out of the chapel, back into the harsh sunlight of the fort, Carson was already plotting. The marriage was a sham, a legal trick. He would prove it. He would find a way to invalidate it. He would watch Mitchell's career burn to the ground, and he would personally hand Sarah over to the men who would take the greatest pleasure in breaking her. He stormed back to his office, his mind racing. There had to be a rule, a regulation, something Mitchell had overlooked. He tore through the Army Code of Conduct, his fingers flipping frantically through the pages, and then he found it. A small, dusty addendum regarding the marriage of officers on active duty in hostile territory. Any such union requires the express written consent of the post commander to be considered valid. The post commander was Colonel Henderson, a man who hated Mitchell, a man who saw the captain's unconventional tactics and rapport with the natives as a threat to his own rigid, by-the-book authority. Henderson was due back from a supply run in 2 days. Carson smiled, a cold, vicious smile. The wedding hadn't saved her. It had only delayed the inevitable. He had 2 days. 2 days to turn the entire fort against Mitchell. 2 days to paint Sarah not as a victim, but as a manipulative spy who had seduced a traitorous captain. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. and Lieutenant Carson was about to change all the rules. That night, in the captain's small, sparse quarters, the reality of their situation settled in. They were strangers, a soldier and an Apache, bound together by a desperate act. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Sarah fulfilled the first part of her bargain. She sat with him, a map spread between them on the small wooden table, and she told him everything. She detailed the plan for the dawn raid on the horse corral, not just where the scouts would be, but how they thought, how they moved, how they used the shadows and the wind to their advantage. She drew the location of the hidden weapons cache in Box Canyon with a piece of charcoal, marking the false rockfall that concealed the entrance. Mitchell listened, his eyes sharp and focused. He was a student of war, and she was giving him a lesson no other soldier had ever received. He asked questions, not just about tactics, but about her people, their beliefs, their motivations. He wasn't just gathering intelligence. He was trying to understand. But as she spoke, she watched him. She saw the way his hand instinctively went to the simple gold band on his own finger, a match to the one he had given her. It was a gesture he seemed unaware of. There was more to this than a strategic alliance. She was sure of it now. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, her voice quiet in the lamplit room. "The truth. The information I gave you is valuable, but not this valuable. You have risked everything." Mitchell looked up from the map. His gray eyes were shadowed, haunted by something she couldn't see. He was silent for a long time, and she thought he wouldn't answer. 13 years ago, he began, his voice raspy with memory. I was a green lieutenant, fresh from the east. My patrol was ambushed by a Mescalero war party. They were better, faster, and they knew the land. We were cut to pieces. He paused, staring at the flickering flame of the lamp. I was wounded, left for dead. My men were all gone. I lay there for a day, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. An Apache hunter found me. He didn't kill me. He didn't take my scalp. He brought me back to his camp, Mitchell continued, his voice barely a whisper. His daughter, she cleaned my wounds. They gave me water and food. They hid me from their own warriors, who would have killed me without a second thought. For a week, they kept me alive. Sarah listened, her heart pounding. The hunter's name was Kushis, but his daughter, she never told me her name. She had the same eyes as you. He looked at her then, and she saw the ghost of a 13-year-old memory flicker in his gaze. He wasn't just seeing her, Sarah Morningstar. He was seeing someone else, a debt long unpaid. He guided me back to my own territory, Mitchell finished. He saved my life, and I swore that if I ever had the chance to repay that debt, I would. So that was it. Honor, a promise made to a ghost. He wasn't saving her. He was saving himself. He was balancing the scales of his own past. But before she could process this revelation, a new chilling thought entered her mind. An Apache hunter and his daughter. 13 years ago. Captain, she said, her voice tight, what did this hunter look like? He was a tall man, Mitchell recalled. He had a long scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. He was missing 2 fingers on his right hand. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She felt the floor tilt beneath her. A scar from a bear attack. 2 fingers lost in a fight with a rival warrior. She knew that man. She knew that scar. The man who had saved Captain James Mitchell's life 13 years ago wasn't just some random Apache hunter. He was her uncle, her father's brother. And he had been murdered 2 years ago. Not by soldiers, not by Mexican slavers. He had been found in his own camp, an army-issue knife in his back. The murder was a mystery, a source of deep shame and anger for her tribe. They suspected a traitor in their midst. And now that traitor's face began to form in her mind. A man who profited from war, a man who played both sides, a man who would kill anyone, Apache or soldier, to get what he wanted. Lieutenant Carson. This wasn't just about a transfer order anymore. This was about murder, and her sham marriage to Captain Mitchell had just put her in the crosshairs of the man who had killed her uncle. Suddenly, Mitchell's quarters didn't feel like a sanctuary. They felt like a trap. The raid at dawn went exactly as she'd predicted. Mitchell, acting on her intelligence, didn't send a large force. He went himself with only Sergeant Williams and 3 of his best men. They hid in the rocks north of the trail, just as she'd instructed. The 2 Apache scouts, confident and careless, walked right into the ambush. They were captured without a single shot being fired. When Mitchell brought them back to the fort, the mood began to shift. The soldiers, who had been whispering about their captain's sanity, now looked at Sarah with a new, grudging respect. Her information was good. She had saved lives. Perhaps the captain wasn't so crazy after all, but the victory was short-lived. Lieutenant Carson saw the captured scouts not as a success for the fort, but as a personal threat. Sarah was proving her value. She was winning hearts and minds. He had to discredit her, and he had to do it fast. He went to the captured scouts. They were her own people from her father's band. They looked at her with hatred as she walked past the stockade. To them, she was a traitor who had sold them out to save her own skin. Carson saw his opportunity. He went into the stockade alone. No one knew what he said to them. No one knew what he offered them. But when he emerged an hour later, he wore a triumphant smirk. He marched directly to Mitchell's quarters and demanded to see the captain. "Your new wife has been playing you for a fool, Captain," Carson announced, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Mitchell stood, his hand resting on his pistol. "Explain yourself, Lieutenant." "I just had a very enlightening conversation with our 2 prisoners," Carson said. "They've confessed everything. The raid this morning, it was a setup, a performance designed to make you trust her." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Trust her for what?" "She was sent here to kill you, Captain," Carson said, delivering the lie with theatrical flair. "She's an assassin. Her whole captive story was a ruse to get close to you. The marriage was her masterstroke. Gaining access to your quarters, your food, your bed. She was just waiting for the right moment to slip a knife between your ribs. It was a brilliant lie. It twisted every fact to fit a narrative of betrayal. It preyed on the soldiers' deepest fears and prejudices." "And how exactly did you get them to confess this?" Mitchell asked, his voice dangerously calm. "They're patriots," Carson said smoothly. "They hate your wife more than they hate us. They see her as a traitor who has shamed their people by marrying a white soldier. They were happy to expose her." Sergeant Williams, who had followed Carson, looked shaken. He looked from the lieutenant to Sarah, his loyalty to Mitchell warring with the poison Carson was pouring into his ears. And that's when Sarah realized the true genius of Carson's plan. It didn't matter if Mitchell believed him. All that mattered was that everyone else did. Carson was isolating them, turning the entire fort into a prison of suspicion. When Colonel Henderson returned, he would walk into a powder keg, a decorated captain accused of treason, married to an enemy assassin. The court-martial would be swift. Mitchell would be disgraced, and she would be handed over to Carson's allies. Her desperate gamble had backfired. She had saved herself from a quick death only to be thrust into a slow, agonizing one, taking the one honorable man in this fort down with her. And the worst part? She had no way to prove her innocence. It was her word, the word of an Apache savage, against the word of 2 of her own warriors and a decorated American officer. She was trapped. They both were. Mitchell knew Carson was lying. He could see it in the man's shifty eyes, in the slick sweat on his brow. But he also knew that the lie was a powerful one. It was a story the men wanted to believe. It was simpler than the complicated truth. "Get out of my quarters, Lieutenant," Mitchell said, his voice low and final. Carson smiled. "Of course, Captain. I'll leave you and your bride to your privacy. But I'd sleep with one eye open if I were you." He turned and walked out, the confident stride of a man who knew he had already won. The moment he was gone, the silence in the room was suffocating. Sergeant Williams shuffled his feet, unable to meet Mitchell's eyes. "Sir," the sergeant began, is it true?" "No, Sergeant," Mitchell said, his voice weary. "It's not true. It's a lie designed to turn this fort against us before the colonel gets back." "But the prisoners were coerced," Mitchell said. "Carson offered them something. Freedom, maybe. Whiskey. A chance to save their own skins by selling us out." He turned to Sarah. "He's trying to isolate us. Make sure that when Henderson arrives, we have no allies." Sarah's mind was racing. Carson's lie was clever, but it had a weakness. It relied on the testimony of the two captured scouts. If she could talk to them, if she could appeal to their honor as Apache warriors, maybe she could convince them to tell the truth. "I need to speak with them," she said. "Alone." Mitchell shook his head. "Impossible. Carson will have them under heavy guard. He won't let you anywhere near them." "Then we have to get to them another way," she insisted. "There has to be a way." An idea began to form, a desperate, dangerous plan. It would involve trust. It would involve putting their lives in the hands of the one man who seemed to be wavering. "Sergeant Williams," Mitchell said, turning to his trusted NCO, "for 3 years you've ridden with me. You've fought beside me. Do you believe I'm a traitor?" The sergeant looked up, his weathered face etched with conflict. He looked at the captain he had followed into hell and back. He looked at the Apache woman whose intelligence had just saved them from a bloody skirmish. "No, sir," Williams said, his voice thick with emotion. "I do not." "Good," Mitchell said, "because I'm going to need your help, and if we get caught, you'll be court-martialed right alongside me." Williams straightened up, the doubt vanishing from his eyes, replaced by the familiar loyalty of a soldier who has chosen his side. "What do you need me to do, Captain?" The plan was simple and insane. Williams would be in charge of the prisoner rations that evening. He would drug the food for the guards watching the stockade. Nothing lethal, just a powerful sleeping draft the post surgeon kept for patients in extreme pain. While the guards were unconscious, Sarah would slip inside the stockade. She would have only a few minutes to convince the warriors, her own kinsmen, to recant their story. Everything depended on her ability to remind them of who they were. That night, the fort was unnaturally quiet. Every soldier was watching, whispering. The battle lines had been drawn. You were either with Carson or you were with the traitor captain and his Apache wife. Sarah watched from the window of Mitchell's quarters as Sergeant Williams delivered the evening meals. Her heart was a cold stone in her chest. She saw him hand the plates to the two guards outside the stockade. She watched as they ate hungrily. Now, all they could do was wait. An hour passed. Then two. The tension was unbearable. Finally, a signal, a low whistle, like the call of a night bird, came from the shadows near the stables. It was Williams. The guards were asleep. It was time. Mitchell grabbed his pistol. "I'm coming with you." "No," Sarah said, placing a hand on his arm. "This is something I must do alone. They will not speak to me if you are there. They will see you as a threat. You must trust me, James." It was the first time she had used his given name. It felt both strange and right. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim light. He saw the fear there, but he also saw a strength that rivaled any warrior he had ever known. He nodded slowly. "Be careful." She slipped out of the quarters and melted into the shadows. She moved with a silence that was born into her blood, a ghost flitting between the adobe buildings. She reached the stockade. As promised, the two guards were slumped against the wall, deep in a drugged sleep. Sergeant Williams was waiting in the shadows. He had already unlocked the gate. He nodded at her, his face grim. "You don't have long." She slipped inside. The two warriors, Kale and Taza, were huddled in the far corner. When they saw her, their eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "Traitor!" Kyle spat, the word a curse. "You come to gloat? To see the men you betrayed?" "I did not betray you," Sarah said, speaking in their native tongue. Her voice was calm but firm. "I saved you. If the captain had not taken you alive this morning, you would be dead." "We would rather be dead than saved by a woman who sleeps in a white man's bed," Taza sneered. The insult stung, but she couldn't let it show. "The man in the blue coat with the pale eyes, Carson. He spoke to you. He made you an offer." "He is an honorable man," Kale said, though his eyes darted away as he spoke the lie. "He saw your treachery and promised to help us bring you to justice." "Honorable?" Sarah laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You call him honorable? Let me tell you about this man. 2 years ago, my uncle, your father's cousin, was found dead, murdered, stabbed in the back with a soldier's knife." She saw a flicker of something in their eyes. They remembered. The whole tribe remembered the shame of that unsolved murder. "The man who killed him," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, was a man who profited from selling army secrets to our enemies. A man who arranged for supply wagons to be ambushed. A man who got rich while soldiers and Apache died. She took a step closer. That man was Lieutenant Carson, and the scout he sold the information to, the man who helped him set the ambush on my uncle, was Diablo. The name hit them like a physical blow. Diablo, the leader of the Chiricahua turncoats, the most feared and hated man in the territory, a man known for his brutality and his greed. "You lie," Taza whispered, but the conviction was gone from his voice. "Do I?" Sarah challenged. "Carson offered you freedom, didn't he? He promised to let you go if you lied about me. But where do you think he's going to send you? Back to our father's camp? No, he is going to send you straight to Diablo. You are loose ends. You know too much. He will trade you for a bottle of whiskey, and Diablo will silence you forever." The truth of her words washed over them, cold and terrifying. They had been played. They had traded their honor, their loyalty, and their very lives for the empty promises of a snake. What do you want from us?" Kyle asked, his voice trembling. "I want you to tell the truth," Sarah said. "When the colonel arrives, you will stand before him, and you will tell him everything. You will tell him that Carson forced you to lie. You will tell him of his partnership with Diablo. You will give Captain Mitchell the proof he needs to stop him." It was a long shot. They would be confessing to conspiracy, and the army was not known for its mercy. "They will hang us," Taza said. "Perhaps," Sarah admitted, "but you will die as Apache warriors, with your honor restored, not as pawns in a white man's game." She let the words sink in. She had planted the seed. Now she could only pray it would take root. Her time was up. She slipped back out of the stockade, meeting the anxious eyes of Sergeant Williams. He locked the gate behind her, and she vanished back into the shadows. When she returned to the captain's quarters, Mitchell was pacing like a caged animal. He stopped when he saw her, his face flooded with relief. "Did they agree?" he asked. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I told them the truth. Now we must wait for the sun to rise, and for the colonel to arrive." They had done all they could. The fate of Fort Dalton and their own lives now rested in the hands of two captured warriors and a colonel known for his hatred of James Mitchell. The odds were not in their favor. Colonel Henderson arrived the next afternoon, a day earlier than expected. He was a bull of a man, with a face that seemed to be permanently set in a scowl. He rode into the fort, took one look at the tense, divided garrison, and knew something was wrong. Lieutenant Carson met him before he even had a chance to dismount, pouring out his poison version of events: the traitor captain, the Apache assassin, the sham marriage, the coerced confession. By the time Mitchell was summoned to the colonel's office, his guilty verdict had already been decided. "Captain Mitchell," Henderson began, his voice cold as a winter morning, "I have been informed of a series of events that, if true, represent the most profound act of treason I have witnessed in my 30 years of service." Mitchell stood at attention, his face unreadable. Sarah stood just outside the door with Sergeant Williams beside her. They were not permitted inside, but they could hear every word. "Lieutenant Carson tells me you have taken an Apache prisoner as your wife," Henderson continued, "that you have ignored direct orders regarding her transfer, and that this woman is a spy sent to assassinate you, a fact to which her own kinsmen have attested." "Sir," Mitchell said, his voice calm and steady, "much of what the lieutenant has told you is true. I did marry Sarah Morningstar, but she is not an assassin, and the prisoner's confession was obtained by Lieutenant Carson through coercion and false promises." Henderson scoffed. "A convenient story, Captain. One that paints you as a hero and Carson as a villain. But I have the sworn testimony of two Apache warriors. Why should I believe you over them?" This was the moment. The fate of everything rested on what happened next. "Because, sir, the prisoners have requested to speak with you," Mitchell said. "They wish to amend their testimony." A flicker of surprise crossed Henderson's face. Carson, standing in the corner of the room, went pale. This was not part of his plan. "Bring them in," Henderson commanded. The two warriors, Kyle and Taza, were marched into the office. They looked haggard and afraid, but as they stood before the colonel, they straightened their backs. They looked at Carson with contempt, and then at Mitchell with a newfound respect. "You have something to say?" Henderson grunted. Cale spoke, his voice clear and strong, translated by a scout who worked for the fort. "The words we spoke yesterday were lies. We were forced to say them by the man with the pale eyes." He pointed a finger at Carson. Carson sputtered, "This is an outrage. They're changing their story to save their own necks." "They are changing their story to reclaim their honor," Mitchell corrected him. Taza then spoke, and he told the colonel everything. He told them about Carson's offer of freedom. He told them about the threat of being handed over to Diablo. And then he delivered the final, devastating blow. "He spoke of his business with Diablo," Taza said. "He bragged that they have been working together for years. He told us that Diablo was the one who helped him kill the Apache elder, the woman's uncle, 2 years ago, so they could steal a shipment of rifles." The room fell silent. The air crackled with the gravity of the accusation. This was no longer about a questionable marriage. This was about murder, treason, and a conspiracy that reached to the very heart of the war. Colonel Henderson stared at Carson, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. Carson was sweating profusely, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "Lies! All of it!" he shrieked. "It's her word against mine, the word of a savage." "Not just her word, Lieutenant," Mitchell said, his voice like ice. He stepped forward and placed a small, leather-bound book on the colonel's desk. "This is your supply ledger. I took the liberty of examining it last night. For the past 2 years, you have been signing for shipments of ammunition and rifles that never made it to this fort. They vanished, just like the shipments Diablo has been using to arm his raiders." The proof was undeniable, the testimony of the warriors, backed by the damning evidence in the ledger. Carson saw the trap close. He saw the hangman's noose tightening around his neck, and he panicked. In a desperate, wild move, he drew his pistol. Not at the colonel, not at Mitchell. He aimed it at Sarah, who was still standing in the doorway. If he was going down, he was taking her with him. But he underestimated the man he was dealing with. Mitchell moved with a speed that defied his age. Before Carson could pull the trigger, Mitchell had crossed the room. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud as Mitchell's fist connected with Carson's jaw. The lieutenant crumpled to the floor unconscious, his pistol clattering across the wooden planks. It was over. In the aftermath, the truth unspooled. Carson was placed in irons, his conspiracy exposed. The two warriors, Cale and Taza, were not hanged. In exchange for their testimony and their help in tracking down the missing weapons, Colonel Henderson, in a rare moment of pragmatism, offered them a full pardon. They were sent back to their people with a message. The real enemy was not the U.S. Army, but the traitors who profited from bloodshed. The weapons cache in Box Canyon was exactly where Sarah had said it would be. Its recovery was a major blow to Diablo and his raiders. And the marriage? Colonel Henderson, after reviewing the situation and the undeniable value of Sarah's intelligence, found it in his heart to sign the paperwork. He officially validated the union, backdating it to the day of the ceremony. He grumbled about it for weeks, but he was a soldier first, and he knew an asset when he saw one. The fort slowly returned to normal, but it was a new normal. The soldiers looked at Sarah not as a captive or a savage, but as the captain's wife, the woman who had faced down a traitor and saved the fort. That evening, Sarah and James stood on the wall of the fort, looking out at the vast desert as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The immediate danger was past, but the future was still an uncharted territory. They were two people from different worlds, bound together by circumstance and violence. They were not in love, not yet, but they were partners. They had forged a bond of trust and respect in the crucible of betrayal and death. "My uncle," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The man who saved you, he was a good man. He believed there could be peace." "He was right," James said, his hand finding hers. The simple gold bands on their fingers caught the last rays of the setting sun. "It won't be easy, but he was right." Their marriage had started as a desperate gamble, a legal loophole to cheat death. But standing there, hand in hand, looking out at the world they had to navigate together, they both realized it had become something more. It was a bridge, a fragile, unlikely bridge between two warring peoples. And it was a start. This story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the greatest rewards, and that honor can be found in the most unexpected places. It's a reminder that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. If you were inspired by Captain Mitchell's impossible choice, do me a favor and hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe because we've got a lot more strange, dark, and mysterious stories to tell. Let me know in the comments below, what would you have risked for a stranger?